In this class, we will review what the final keyword means in Java. In Java, the final keyword is an overloaded word. An overloaded is a word which means different things based on the context. So it all depends on the context in which it is being used, and the meaning of the final keyword will change. So when you apply the word final to a class, so the final keyword can be applied to a class, it can be applied to a method, it can be applied to a instance attribute, it can be applied to a class attribute, or it can be applied to a parameter that you pass to a method. Okay, so based on the context, the meaning changes. When you apply the final keyword to a class, it means that the class cannot be subclassed. That means you cannot derive from the class, from the base class, which has been declared final. And when you apply the final keyword to a method, it means that the method cannot be overridden in a subclass. So you cannot extend that class and in the derived class override the method which was declared final in the base class. Okay, now let's see what final means when you apply it to a variable. A final variable can only be initialized once, either via an initializer or an assignment statement. Once you have initialized it, you cannot change it. It is set in stone. Okay, but the important thing to remember is it does not have to be initialized at the point where it is declared. This is called as a blank final variable. It is called as a blank because you have not given it any value as yet. But a blank final instance variable, it should be initialized inside the constructor. And if you have a blank final static variable, it must be initialized or assigned in the static initializer of a class in which it is declared. If you don't do that, in both the cases, there will be a compile time error. Now let's look at an example program which shows all these different rules. So here I have two classes called demo final base and demo final derived. Okay, now let's apply the final keyword at the class level. See this demo final base, we have the final keyword here. So now let's try to derive this class, derive from this class. So we have the demo final derived. What I'm going to do is I'm going to comment out these two lines, comment out this line, and make this class extend the demo final base. Now see what the error that shows up. It says the type demo final derived cannot subclass the final class demo final base. So when you apply the keyword final to a class, it cannot be subclassed. So if I remove this, now that error goes away, because any class can extend any other class. But if that base class is declared final, then you cannot subclass it. So you'll see that error and you cannot subclass it. So I'm going to not subclass it. Okay, now let's say I'm going to remove this, the final keyword. Now let's try to understand the final keyword applied to a method. So I have the method called foo, which has been declared final in the base class. That means you cannot override it in a derived class. So let's make a derived class which extends the demo final base, and in that class I have a method called foo which is commented out here. I'm going to uncomment it, and now I see an error which says cannot override the final method from demo final base, because the foo has been declared as final in the base class. That means it cannot be overridden. But if I remove this final here, that error goes away, and you can override that method in the derived class. So let me just undo these changes. So now you have seen what final means when you apply it to a method. You cannot override the method in the derived class when the method is declared final. Okay, now let's see what final means when you apply it to a instance attribute. Okay, now I have the instance attribute called name, which has been declared final. But if you see here, I have not initialized it. This is a blank final instance variable. So the rule is it has to be initialized by the time the constructor of that class ends. So here I'm initializing the name to equal to Ben. If I remove this or comment it out, I will see an error message. It says a blank final field may not have been initialized. So you should always initialize a blank final field in the constructor of the class. But if you see this ID, it is not final. If I comment it out, there is no error, and the ID will probably get the default value for int, which is 0. So only final blank instance variables have to be initialized within the constructor of the class. Now let's try to look at a final static final. So you have a constant array of ints, okay, and it is static. That means it's a class variable and it is static. Okay, and this is what is called as a static initializer. The static initializer block will be loaded the first time the JVM loads the class from the class file. So the first time the demo final derived.class is loaded by the JVM, the static initializer will be run only once, and there you're initializing this constant array of ints, which is a final. It is a blank static final variable, as opposed to this name, which is a blank instance final variable. Okay, so let's try to comment this line out, and now you'll see that there is an error. It says the blank final field may not have been initialized. Because it is static, it's a class variable, so a class variable will never be initialized in the constructor. Only instance variables are initialized in the constructor. Class variables are always initialized in the static initializer block of the class. So I need to initialize it, so I need to uncomment this out for that error to go away. Okay. Now let's look at some other examples of this final. Inside my main program, I create an object of this class, okay, and then in that object of the class I am setting the name to Sola. If you see here, this name was initialized to Ben, and this name is a final variable, so once initialized you cannot change it. So let's try to change it and see what happens. I'll say dc.name equal to Sola, and now I see an error. What's the error? The final field cannot be assigned, because once it has been initialized you cannot change it. So let's comment that out. Okay, but I can create a local variable called name and I can assign values to it. This name is not the same as this name. The local variable will always override the instance variable. Okay, and then this name is a string. String is immutable, so you can it's immutable. But you can always assign a different string to that name. Okay, now I have a local variable called constant name. Okay, but it is declared final. So once it has been initialized, you cannot change it. So if I try to change it by giving a different name to it, it's going to give an error message. The final local variable cannot be assigned because it has been already been initialized here. Okay. Okay, now I have this constant array of ints, which is a final static and has already been initialized in the static initializer. Okay, see, this constant array of ints is pointing to an array of 10 integers, but here I'm changing it. I said it is final, right? How can you change it? The thing is, it is pointing to an array. It will always point to the same array of integers, but the array element values can individually be changed. So here what I'm doing is I'm saying the 7th element or this would be the 8th element of the array. I'm assigning a value of 6. That is okay, but I cannot assign it to a new array of ints. So I cannot say, for example, oh, yeah, here it is. So I cannot say constant array of ints equal to new int 5, because it has already been pointing to an array of 10 integers. It will always point to the same array of 10 integers. The individual array elements can be changed, but the entire array that it is pointing to, that cannot be changed. It will always point to the same array of 10 integers. You cannot make it point to an array of 5 integers. Okay. Now let's look at an array of ints which is pointing to an array of 10 integers. This array of ints is static, but it is not final. Since it is not final, I can make it point to different arrays. But if it is final, once it is pointing to a certain array, you cannot make it change to point to a different array. Now let's look at a local variable which is final. Since it is final, once it has been initialized, you cannot change it. So you'll get an error which says local variable I, it is final, so it cannot be assigned. Now let's look at an object which is declared final. Here I'm creating DC1, which is an object of demo final derived, and then I'm creating another object called DC2, which is final, and that is pointing to DC1. And then I create another object called DC3. Okay. Now I cannot make DC2 point to DC3 because DC2 is final. So once something is final and it has been initialized, you cannot make it point to something else. So I cannot say DC2, I cannot assign DC2 to DC3 because DC2 itself is final. Once something is final, you cannot assign anything to it. But if it's an array, if it is pointing to an array, the individual array elements can be changed, but you cannot make it point to a different array. Okay. Now DC2 is final, right? But I can change the ID of DC2. The important thing to remember is DC2 is final, but the contents of DC2 are not final. So DC2 is an object which contains some instance attributes. If an instance attribute of DC2 is not final, you can change its value. But what DC2 itself is pointing to, that you cannot change. Remember, in Java, the name of a variable is like a reference to the actual physical object in memory. So DC2 is now pointing to the physical object created by this statement here. So it will always point to DC1. You cannot make it point to DC3, DC4 or anything else. But you can assign, for instance variables of DC2, you can change the instance variables if they are not final. But the name attribute, as you know, it is final. So even though DC2 is final, I cannot change the name because the name has been initialized to Ben. Okay. And finally, I can apply the final keyword to the parameter of a method. Okay. I'm saying this J is final. So inside this, I cannot change J because J has been declared final. So it is treated as a local variable. Okay. So the word final can mean so many different things based on the context. So I want you all to try out this program and understand how final